So I believe we should start. And briefly, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oliver Heydorn. Thank you for being with us. Dr. Heydorn is the founder and director of the Clifford Hugh Douglas Institute for the Study and Promotion of Social Credit. It is based in Ontario, Canada, but it works really globally with people anywhere who are advocating and implementing social credit. Dr. Heydorn studied biology first and then philosophy, and has a PhD from the Catholic Pontifical, that's the word, Pontifical University of Santiago, Chile. He taught at 3 different universities in 3 different countries before starting the Institute. And he is also the lead architect of an animated video series on Douglas social credit, which is on YouTube, and I'll try to post that on the chat as well. He has authored 4 books on Douglas social credit theory, and the titles of which I'm going to read for you, and they give you some idea, if you just listen, of the foci of Dr. Heydorn's work. Social Credit Economics, The Economics of Social Credit and Catholic Social Teaching, Social Credit Philosophy, and the last one that at least I know of is Lives of Our Own. The subtitle, Social Credit, Catholicism, and a Distributist Social Order. So thank you, Dr. Heydorn, both for attending other parts of this conference, as well as for presenting to us now on how Douglas social credit can and will restore honesty and functionality to the financial system. So the
Thank you very
spotlight,
much.
yeah, is yours.
Okay, I do have a PowerPoint, so we'll put it up.
It is up.
Okay,
Yeah.
can everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Lucille. I'm looking forward to introducing Douglas social credit as a monetary reform model to this AMI audience. Let's start with a shared truth. Both Douglas social creditors and AMI members agree that our economies are deeply flawed and that it is the financial system which bears much of the blame. Whether it's rising debt, economic instability, or unmet needs, despite abundant resources, the economy isn't serving the average person as well as it ought. This is why monetary reform is urgently needed. But what should reform look like? Different diagnoses lead quite naturally to different solutions. Today, I will walk you through the Douglas social credit model, its explanation for what's broken, its prognosis regarding the existing system, and its practical solutions by going through a series of questions. We'll also briefly compare these ideas to the AMI and AFJM proposals, such as those laid out in the NEED and AMRA Acts. First, an important clarification. Douglas social credit, which is based on the ideas of the British engineer, Major C.H. Douglas, born in 1879 and died in 1952, has nothing to do whatsoever with the Chinese style social credit surveillance system. The two are, in fact, opposites. The CCP system uses state control to monitor, judge, and then reward or punish the behavior of individual citizens. By contrast, Douglas social credit, or DSC for short, seeks to empower individuals, giving ordinary people, through a reformed financial system, the ability to hold governments, businesses, and institutions to account. DSC is all about freedom, not control, and was a significant worldwide movement, especially during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. There was even a social credit-inspired bill introduced to the American Congress in 1932 called the Goldsboro Bill. It passed the House 289 to 60, but was defeated in the Senate. So the first question, what is monetary reform and why does it matter? When we talk about monetary reform, we are talking about changing some aspect of the current financial system, or even about replacing the existing system with an entirely new system. I want to make it clear right from the outset that from a DSC point of view, the financial system is broader than just the banking system. It encompasses the banking system, but it also includes the price system and the taxation system. The banking system deals mainly with the creation and destruction of money, mostly in the form of bank credit. The price system with the generation of costs and prices and the process of production and their liquidation upon consumption. And the taxation system with government expenditure and its recovery through taxes. Just a few moments ago, I noted that both social creditors and AMI members agree that the reigning financial system is deeply flawed. But in what ways is it broken? From a DSC standpoint, there are two fundamental problems. There is, in the first place, what might be termed the equity problem. Many people, when they think of monetary reform, are concerned with questions of justice. Who benefits from money creation? Are some people benefiting disproportionately and at the illegitimate expense of others? Is the pattern of distribution regarding benefits and harms associated with money creation truly just, whatever your standard of justice might happen to be? Is there broad spectrum access and inclusion where the benefits are concerned? In other words, whatever the financial system does it do it fairly? Is it a just system? The second problem is more technical and pragmatic in nature, and I will refer to it as the functionality problem. How well does the financial system fulfill its true purpose? Does it achieve what it is supposed to achieve in an effective, efficient, and reasonable manner? Does it deliver the practical results that we might rightfully expect from it? Since it is a core part of our basic societal infrastructure, is it working in a highly satisfactory manner in terms of performance, stability, and resilience? In other words, does the financial system do what it is supposed to do well? Does it work well? Now, I don't want to place these two problems in hermetically sealed containers because they are intimately related. There are technical or practical aspects to the equity problem, and there are justice-related aspects to the functionality problem. Nevertheless, they remain quite distinct. DSC does not downplay the gravity of the equity problem, but it nevertheless regards the functionality problem as the more fundamental issue. Why? Because solving the equity problem according to some abstract standard of justice, such as strict equality, or from each according to his ability to each according to his need, or a strict meritocracy, etc., will not necessarily address the functionality issue and could even make things worse. What good is it to have what is deemed to be justice, a just distribution of the harms and benefits associated with money creation, if your financial system doesn't work very well and everyone is living in poverty as a result? Justice is not a sufficient condition for functionality. By contrast, if the functionality problem is solved appropriately, the equity problem will tend to resolve itself as a byproduct. Why? Because a system that works well, that is stable, resilient, and offers satisfactory results to its end users must embody some kind and measure of justice by its very nature. The fact that functionality is a sufficient condition for a viable form of equity, while the reverse is not true, helps to explain why DSC prioritizes the question of functionality. Because DSC is centered on this question of functionality, it also recognizes that monetary reform must reach beyond banking. According to the DSC diagnosis, the price system and the taxation system are also malfunctioning. Social credit therefore proposes that changes be made to all three components of the financial system. The second question, what is the purpose of the financial system and why does it fail to fulfill that purpose well? When we claim that the reigning financial system does not do what it's supposed to do well, two questions arise immediately. Firstly, what is the purpose of the financial system? And secondly, why does it fail to fulfill that purpose well? According to DSC, the true purpose of the financial system is to mobilize and regulate economic energy in such a way that the economy's useful productive capacity, what Douglas called the real credit of a society, can be fully actualized and distributed to consumers. In other words, the true purpose of the financial system is to serve as a dutiful handmaid to the real economy. Finance is not an end in itself, but rather a means to an end. But then, what is the purpose of the real economy? Douglas is unequivocal. The real economy exists for one purpose and one purpose only: to deliver the goods and services which people need in order to survive and flourish, and to achieve this with the least amount of labor and resource consumption. The economy does not exist for the purpose of creating jobs, multiplying figures in bank accounts, whether of profits or of wages, or to impose a moral discipline on the population. These things could be a means, a superabundant byproduct, or an incentive, but they are not the purpose. It's not why the economy exists in the first place. This brings us to the second question. Why does the financial system fail to fulfill its purpose? The easiest way to answer this is to say that the financial system fails because it is improperly designed. It's a design failure. If its purpose is to facilitate the full actualization of the economy's potential in view of the real demand, and with the least amount of trouble to everyone, it is not fit for purpose. However, if the de facto purpose of the system deviates from this, its true purpose, and aims instead to centralize wealth, power, and privilege in the hands of a few, the owners of the system, then we might say that the existing financial system is eminently fit for purpose. And that brings us back to the equity problem, but more on that later. Proper design requires that the financial system should be an honest system. That is, it should be a system that paints, in the abstract world of numbers, an accurate picture of the concrete facts of the real economy. A helpful image here is to think of the financial system as a special kind of projector, one that casts a representation of the real economy onto a numerical screen, but a screen that also serves as an interface. You see, the financial system is not just representational, it is also operational. We depend on the financial image in order to interact with the real economy. When that projected image corresponds faithfully to reality, accurately reflecting our collective capacity to produce and consume, the economy can function smoothly. Goods and services can be produced in the required qualities and quantities and effectively distributed to all who need or desire them, while liquidating all the costs of production. However, when that projected image fails to accurately reflect the physical economic facts, when it artificially limits our producer and consumer capacities, and then misdirects, distorts our economic activity in consequence, the economy struggles to deliver the desired outcomes. In sum, the reigning financial system fails because it is structurally and functionally dishonest. And this failure has a strong negative impact on the real economy. Question number 3. How does the current financial system fail to fulfill its purpose? We've looked at why the financial system fails to fulfill its purpose. Now let's look at the mechanics, or the how. The system, as I've said, is dishonest in its very design, but in what exactly does this dishonesty consist? The structural dishonesty or misrepresentation can take one of two basic forms. Firstly, insufficient producer credit. On the one hand, the financial system fails to provide enough producer credit to fully or adequately represent the useful productive capacity. That is, there is an artificial scarcity of money in view of the economy's productive potential. And secondly, insufficient consumer income. On the other hand, the financial system fails to provide enough consumer income to represent, at remunerative prices, the value of what is being produced. That is, there is an underlying artificial scarcity of money in the form of consumer buying power in view of the flow of real wealth. As a result, production and consumption are both artificially hampered. On the level of production, there are innumerable cases where there is, on the one hand, some legitimate need for food, shelter, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. And on the other, the natural resources, labor, technology, and know-how to produce the good or service that would meet that need. And yet, production does not occur. Why? Because the present financial system can't or won't create the money needed to catalyze that production. And so many legitimate needs go unmet. In this case, the financial system does not accurately reflect the useful productive capacity. A simple example can illustrate the problem. Suppose an economy needs to produce 200 billion of goods and services each year to meet basic needs. However, under the current financial system, perhaps only 150 billion in producer credit is issued, and so only 150 billions is actually produced. The population goes without the additional 50 billion in goods and services that could easily have been provided. In this case, the financial system has failed to represent the real capacity of the economy in the form of sufficient producer credit, and its productive function has been significantly hampered. On the level of consumption, Douglas claimed that the price system registers the buildup of costs and hence prices at a faster rate than it distributes incomes with which those costs can be met. Money is spent by businesses on raw material, labor, real capital, machines and equipment, etc. And costs are incurred. But only some of these payments are transformed into consumer income in the form of wages, salaries, and dividends. As a result, the flow of costs and prices is not in an automatic balance with the flow of incomes. For example, let's imagine, and this is a contrived example, that the economy produces 100 muffins per year, and each muffin needs to be sold at 1 penny in order to recover all costs and return a profit. Because of the way the system is structured, perhaps only 60 pennies are automatically, and that's the key word there, automatically distributed to workers in the form of income. With that income, the public can only buy 60 muffins. Unless additional income is found, 40 muffins go unsold, bakers cannot recover costs, and businesses risk collapse. What has been produced in physical terms cannot be paid for in financial terms because the system has failed to represent with sufficient income the value of what has been produced. This is dishonest accounting that systematically hampers the consumptive function of the economy. So money in the form of credit is being created and destroyed all the time. And as it's being created and destroyed, costs and prices are being generated faster than incomes are being distributed. And in the social credit world, we refer to that as the gap. And we have a quote here from Douglas's 1932 book, The New and the Old Economics. He says, under certain circumstances, almost universal in modern industry, purchasing power cannot be equal to prices if purchasing power and prices are both considered as a flow. Now, I want to spend a bit of time examining the causes of the recurring price income gap, and I want to make it clear that on Douglas's analysis, usury, which I would define as rent taking in banking or monopoly profiteering, is not, according to Douglas, the main cause of the gap. The alleged truth of the debt virus hypothesis, according to which people have to borrow more money to pay for the principal plus interest of past debts because banks don't create the interest, is a gross exaggeration. Banks also spend money into the economy with which a good portion of those interest payments can be made when they pay their operating expenses, when they distribute profits, and so forth. Profit making, savings, the reinvestment of savings, taxation, and deflationary bank policies can all play a role, but the primary cause behind the gap lies in how the existing financial system registers technological labor displacement, the replacement of human work and production by machines and tools, or real capital. From 1800 to the present, the balance of productive effort has shifted dramatically. In 1800, around 45% of work was done by humans, 45% by animals, and 10% by machines. By 1900, machines supplied half of all work. By 1950, they supplied 80 to 90%. Today, machines provide 95 to 99%, while human and animal contributions are negligible in comparison. The dominance of mechanized labor in our current production system is overwhelming. Now, the financial system designed in a pre-industrial era struggles with modern capital dynamics. Under current cost accounting conventions, not all production costs become consumer income. Labor costs, call them A, like wages, are distributed as consumer income, but capital costs, call them B, such as equipment replacement, maintenance, or capital loan repayments, must be recovered in prices without fully circulating as income in the same period of time or at all. Businesses set aside funds for depreciation and to repay loans, yet the income distributed via capital production falls short of covering those costs. To remain viable, businesses charge A plus B in prices, but only A is fully distributed through the same process as income. This mismatch creates a structural purchasing power gap, as A alone cannot buy A plus B. In other words, the system records various financial costs, but it does not ensure that there is enough consumer income automatically issued to meet the resulting prices. This built-in imbalance means that reforming banking is not enough. The most significant problem with our financial system lies in the price system. To avoid any confusion, the gap in question is an underlying gap, not always a visible or de facto one. The system employs many compensatory methods: business expansion, government spending, consumer debt, exports, to fill it. But these measures only mask the imbalance, and when they fail, the gap resurfaces. There is a second problem that arises from the financial and economic misreading of technological labor displacement, the phenomenon of technological unemployment. As machines replace human labor, fewer work hours are needed to supply all necessary goods and services. This results in some people being thrown out of work, technological unemployment. This should register as a gain. Why? Because it means society can produce everything we require with less and less effort, freeing people up for leisure, culture, and innovation. But under the current system, these gains are not realized. Technological unemployment is actually converted into a liability, and I'll explain how. For the current financial system, laboring under the price-income gap, unemployed workers appear as unused resources who can be reabsorbed into production in order to sustain the increased growth and debt that are necessary to fill the price-income gap. For the economic system, unemployed workers are people without incomes. And because income is tied, for the most part, to employment under the prevailing policy of full employment, jobs must be created for them, whether or not those jobs are actually needed or useful. This produces a kind of double bind. On the one hand, if these technologically displaced workers remain unemployed, they will lack incomes, the gap will widen, and consumption will falter. On the other hand, if full employment is enforced as part of a gap-filling exercise in order to prevent economic stalling, many useless, witless, redundant, and perhaps even destructive jobs must be invented simply to provide incomes. Either way, the gains of mechanization are lost. Instead of reducing the need for work, technological advances intensify the demand for work under the current financial and economic systems. And the problem grows worse with time. The more machines displace labor, the smaller labor costs become relative to capital costs, and the larger the price-income gap becomes. Douglas's central insight is that this is not incidental but structural. A gap-creating financial system wedded to a full employment economic system cannot coexist harmoniously with increasing technological efficiency. The result is a civilization trapped in a catch-22. We can have gross scarcity amidst abundance or potential abundance, or we can have a situation in which the more efficient our labor becomes with the help of machines, the more absurdly we must be compelled to labor, thus undoing the whole purpose for introducing machines into production in the first place. And I have a quote here from a speech that Douglas gave before the King of Norway in 1935. The speech is Money and the Price System. And he says, so long as people demand of us that we must solve the unemployment problem, while our best brains are, in effect, endeavoring to increase the unemployment problem, it is obvious we shall get nowhere. Question number 4. What are the financial, economic, and social consequences of this dishonesty? As we have seen, the current financial system does attempt to balance the price system out, but it does so in the main by constantly increasing government, business, and consumer debt. In other words, some sector of the economy is expected to borrow additional money into existence in order to balance the flow of consumer incomes with the flow of consumer prices. Otherwise, we have a recession or worse. But this solution is also a violation of the principle that the financial system, in the image it projects of reality, should accurately reflect reality. Why? Because whatever has been produced has already been paid for in physical terms. Otherwise, it would not exist. That is to say that the community has already turned over the raw materials, the labor, the use of the real capital, etc., all that was necessary to bring the goods and services into being. If the financial system accurately reflected reality, if it were an honest system, then it would enable us to consume what we have produced by automatically giving us sufficient income to distribute all goods and services and to liquidate once and for all the costs of production. Instead, the system can only fill the gap by putting us further into debt individually and collectively. We are given more buying power with which the surplus goods and services can be purchased and costs covered, but only at the cost of mortgaging our future incomes in order to service mounting government, business, and consumer debts. Now, this way of dealing with the gap, because it doesn't reflect reality, provokes or intensifies a vast number of further problems. We are basically dependent on forever increasing society's aggregate debt in order to achieve a balance, some kind of equilibrium in the price system. But it is an equilibrium that is A, exogenous, B, non-liquidating because it incurs additional costs, that is debt, in order to meet costs, and C, increasingly unstable. The resulting problems are so varied and so deep that I cannot do them full justice here. Instead, I want to focus on one problem that is particularly relevant to the present framing of the monetary reform issue, and then I will offer a short list of the various symptoms of dysfunction that are heavily implicated in the insane proposition that we can borrow ourselves out of debt. The first matter that I want to discuss is related to the equity issue that I referenced at the very beginning of the talk. Who benefits the most from the creation of the money supply, and under what terms? And I want to point out that most of the usury, most of the economic rent-taking and banking is due to the long-term debt on which compound interest is charged that is used to fill the recurring price income gap. If there were no gap, if we did not need to fill it with additional long-term debts, banking would not be as profitable as it is. Filling the gap with debt is a windfall situation for the banks. It transfers wealth, power, that is control over policy, and privilege from the bottom 90% to the top 10% of society, centralizing these in the hands of a few, the owners of the system. Beyond that, relying on debt to fill the gap is intimately and heavily implicated in the following symptoms of financial, economic, and social dysfunction. So, the boom and bust cycle, constant inflation, mostly cost push, but also demand pull, the misdirection of economic resources, economic inefficiency, waste, and sabotage, alongside forced economic growth and built-in obsolescence, an ever-increasing mountain of societal debt that is in the aggregate unrepayable, recurring financial crises, heavy and often increasing taxation, wage and debt slavery, forced migration and cultural dislocation, unnecessary stresses and strains, social conflict, environmental degradation, and international economic conflict leading to war. The debt money system, in conjunction with the underlying and recurring price income gap, becomes a corrosive, entropy producing force that threatens the long-term survival of this civilization. So that brings us to the fifth question. What needs to be done to fix the financial system so that it will function well? The whole purpose of the Douglas social credit proposals is to redesign the financial system so that it accurately reflects reality. If finance is structurally dishonest, then the solution must be to make it honest. I won't say make finance honest again, because I have no intention of being partisan. And beyond that, it's not even clear whether finance has ever been fully honest in modern times. But if we can make finance honest, we can restore its full functionality. And we have another quote here from Douglas. For instance, I have no doubt whatever that there is one single test which can be applied to any financial scheme which is put before you for your consideration, and that is whether it represents reality, just as we know that the fundamental falsity of the present financial system is that it distorts and perverts reality. So how do we make finance honest on Douglas's view? There are three main ingredients in his recipe. Firstly, credit should function as a utility that is both privately and publicly administered and publicly regulated. The key issue is one of policy. Does the financial system serve the common interest, as societal infrastructure should, or does it serve the interests of an oligarchy? The former is a democratic policy, the latter a despotic one. From a social credit perspective, the central issue is not simply who creates money or who directly benefits, but whether the financial system as a whole serves a democratic policy. A government monopoly on money creation, for instance, could still serve oligarchic interests if the state has been captured by those interests. Likewise, private competition could, in some cases, better serve the public interest than a public monopoly. Douglas therefore proposed a hybrid system. A national credit office would oversee monetary policy in the common interest. It would maintain a national balance sheet to underwrite the creation of credit for production in line with the useful productive capacity, and a national profit and loss account to justify the creation of additional debt-free credit to fill the recurring price income gap in favor of consumers. Private banks would continue to assess business viability and create credit for production, as they do now, but they would be under stricter regulation by the NCO. Douglas believed that sufficient private competition disciplines the allocation of productive credit and decentralizes decision-making, preventing waste and ensuring greater freedom. But the NCO, by issuing debt-free consumer credits, would break the monopoly private banks currently hold over credit creation. This hybrid of debt money and debt-free credit would transform the system from one that indebts society ever more deeply to one that balances production debts with sufficient cost liquidating income, reflecting reality in service to the common citizen. In other words, DSC would ensure that all excess or surplus production debts can be met with a sufficient flow of real income, a kind of perpetual and dynamic debt jubilee. The NCO would issue a national dividend, a periodic payment to every citizen, regardless of employment status. Pragmatically, this is required to supply the additional consumer credit needed for the economy to function, especially as technological labor displacement reduces incomes and people are thrown out of work. Ethically, it is justified because the main cause of the gap lies in real capital, the inventions, discoveries, and cultural heritage built up by past generations. This heritage belongs to all, not just a privileged few. Alongside the dividend, Douglas proposed a national discount or compensated price mechanism, a general reduction of retail prices funded by the NCO. Retailers would be reimbursed for the difference. The discount would be determined by the production-consumption ratio. The aim is to strip out purely financial costs from prices and align prices with the real costs of production. That is, the actual consumption of resources and depreciation of real capital used up in making goods. Under current accounting, we in effect pay twice for real capital, once for its production and again for its replacement. The compensated price would correct this, ensuring consumers pay only for what is actually consumed in production, not artificial financial charges. Whatever is physically possible and desirable should be financially possible. All that is required is to alter the financial system so that it accurately represents the physical facts and potential of the real economy. And we have another quote here from Douglas: "What is physically possible is financially possible." Douglas' social credit, by making creative use of the technical flaw in the price system, would transform society into a gigantic profit-sharing cooperative, and would do this without directly touching or interfering with private or corporate profits at all. All of the problems I had mentioned earlier, the long list of symptoms, including most especially the equity issue, the centralization of wealth, privilege, and power, would be resolved by the DSC remedial measures as a byproduct. Another quote from Douglas, he says, "Now, just as a man is taxed upon his assets and has to pay the tax in money, which is purchasing power, although those assets do not grow money, just so do the price values of industrial assets enter into the price of the goods which are sold. And the first objective of social credit is to provide sufficient money to meet these charges, which occur in ultimate products as a result of the existence of industrial assets." Okay, section 6, a few clarifying questions. I'll run through these pretty quickly. Isn't this just universal basic income? No, it's conventional UBI typically involves the redistribution of income via taxes or proposes to pay for the disbursement via an increase in public debt. Social credit proposes creating new credit, debt-free, in line with real production in order to balance the flow of income with the flow of prices. Second question, would this be inflationary? No, because the new money is tied directly to production, already completed and in reference to an existing gap. The compensated price also directly offsets inflation by reducing prices while maintaining producer margins. Beyond that, the dividend and the discount are to be issued in lieu of all the existing debt-based palliatives for dealing with the gap. In other words, excessive government borrowing and business borrowing for excessive or redundant production and programs or capital production for export, as well as consumer borrowing involving the creation of new credit, would all have to cease. They would no longer be needed. Third question, would people stop working? The national dividend mechanism has a feedback loop that could serve as a regulatory mechanism. If too many people stopped working, production would diminish. If production diminishes, the aggregate gap gets smaller and the dividends decrease, making it harder to live off of the dividend alone, and thus indicating the need for increased employment to deliver the goods and services that people want. Fourthly, is this socialism? If socialism means government or state ownership of the means of production, a command economy, a welfare state with a large bureaucracy and heavy taxation, the answer is no. Douglas social credit preserves private property, free enterprise, and individual choice. It simply ensures that the financial system accurately reflects reality for the benefit of everyone. Thus, it is not a species of laissez-faire capitalism or neoliberalism either. Fifth question, how would public production be handled? Insofar as there is real demand for public production, which is production that cannot be provided adequately by the market, the government could borrow at the costs of administration sufficient producer credit from the National Credit Office on the basis of the national balance sheet in order to finance that production. Tax revenue could then be collected to pay off these public debts. There are other ways that this can be done. And this is the last section. Seventh question, how does DSC differ from AMI's proposals like the NEED Act? I want to bring the DSC model to bear on the AMI AIFJ model as laid out in the NEED Act and AMRA. As I understand this model, the fundamental premise is that the root flaw in the current financial system lies in the private control over money creation. This is regarded as inherently illegitimate and exploitative. The proposed remedy is to centralize the power of money creation, free of debt, in the hands of the state, and for the government of the day to spend this money into the economy by focusing on infrastructure investment and social programs. The private banking sector is significantly curtailed in its operations, and the locus of financial agency is moderately shifted from markets in favor of the government and its policy priorities. This approach is perhaps best categorized as a dirigiste or technocratic public money model, wherein social equity and macroeconomic stability are pursued through top-down intervention and a certain degree of centralized planning. It contains a number of interesting ideas, and assuming it could be run by honest and competent experts and statesmen, it would likely be an improvement over the status quo. So the DSC model and the AMI-inspired models both agree that there are substantial equity and functionality problems where the current financial system is concerned, and that the creation and issuance of some kind and measure of debt-free money is essential for resolving these difficulties. Those are the major points of agreement. The DSC model differs, however, in the following ways. So these are various points of contrast. Focus. Unlike some readings or interpretations of the AMI model, which seem to prioritize the equity problem and see functionality as dependent on the restoration of institutional justice in the banking system, the DSC model is focused first on the functionality problem, seeing equity in banking as something that will be largely addressed as a byproduct of solving the functionality issue. Second point of contrast, diagnosis. As far as that functionality problem is concerned, the DSC model is centered on the problems posed by the recurring price-income gap and technological unemployment, whereas the AMI model does not appear to explicitly or overtly recognize the gap or tech unemployment. Thirdly, money creation. To fill the gap in a way that properly balances the price system, DSC would have a national credit office measure the gap and create sufficient debt-free credit to fill it in lieu of additional debt. Private banks would continue, however, to create credit for productive purposes, not for purely speculative or extractive activities. The AMI model, by contrast, would replace all debt money with debt-free state money. Fourth, employment. To deal with tech unemployment, DSC would distribute a debt-free national dividend to each citizen and also lower prices via the debt-free national discount. DSC would also replace the current policy of full employment with a policy of the minimum employment necessary. The AMI model, as far as I can tell, is committed to full employment. Administration. The DSC model could be described as a double hybrid model. It combines both debt money in the form of producer credit for production and debt-free credit to balance incomes with producer debts, thereby resolving debt claims with sufficient income in every economic cycle. It also has a role both for the state and for private banks where money creation and issuances are concerned. The National Credit Office would be responsible for the debt-free inputs and for regulating the private banks properly, while the private banks would compete with each other where the allocation of producer credit to businesses are concerned. The AMI model seems to move more closely in the direction of a pure, more monopolistic model where the state creates all money and the banks can lend for private production by obtaining enough money from various sources for that purpose. Policy. The DSC model, while relying on a certain degree of centralized administration, seeks to enfranchise the individual directly with buying power and choice. It is a bottom-up model, if you like. The AMI model, by contrast, appears to involve a greater degree of centralized administration, plus a substantial centralization of control over the initial issuance or allocation of money, with the intent that government spending on its policy objectives would trickle down for the benefit of the individual. Philosophy, finally, and this will help to explain some of the aforementioned differences that have been highlighted. The DSC model is based on a social philosophy that the individual is more important than the group, and that the group and group activity exists not for abstract collective objectives, but for the concrete benefit of the common individual first. This implies the decentralization of the power of money in favor of the common individual to the extent that this is compatible with a well-functioning financial and economic system. And I have related to this last seventh point of contrast a quote from Douglas. Consumer control of production is the only basis of freedom, and no method of obtaining consumer control has ever been tried with success, which did not ban state control of money and credit and include decentralized individual credit power. Lucille already mentioned the professionally animated series, which is available on YouTube. So I invite AMI members to explore further how DSC's focus on functionality can complement your equity-driven reforms, fostering a richer conversation so that there can be a brighter future for everyone. And we'll end on this quote from Douglas from his very first book, Economic Democracy, 1920. The whole promise of a brighter, probably a very bright future for the world lies in doing the best possible things in the best possible way. Thank you very much.
I'll wait for Lucille.
Yeah. That was very concise and both deep and broad. So thank you very much. That is an accomplishment. And there are hands raised already, so I will forego my questions and let those get in. And Stephen, maybe though you could guide is.
Yeah, maybe let's go with Nikki, because I'm going for people who haven't. I see Peter there who hasn't. So
Oliver, I like what you said. And at 11 o'clock this morning, this is Eastern time here in the United States of America, I had put in a template. And if you just click on that template for $1 million, and there are 62 people, 63 people right now on the program, you see how much $1 million could be, how $1 million can come from the Federal Reserve System by going directly through a local bank, and how much the people in seniorage would have to pay of the 62 of us or 63 of us that are now on the call. So if you want to share that template on your on the screen and just change the number of participants, you'll see right there the mathematics are already there. Okay,
we'll need a
with the
little
current system of the current cost of printing notes
Nikki, you
directly
might want to
through
make sure the template opens.
Say again.
Make sure the template opens because I had trouble.
Oh, you had trouble? Oh, okay. Well,
Okay.
the
That-
template
that's
is
not a
open on my
question-
screen.
That's not a question directly for Oliver. So we'll look at the template and we'll keep going right now.
Well, I think it will help his presentation by presenting it, when he does it again. I yield. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nikki, and we appreciate that. And we're always learning.
Peter Winslow is on the screen.
Good. Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucille. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you so much, Oliver, for a really wonderful presentation and a compelling argument. My question here is a little bit parochial from the vantage point of a public bank. In the scheme that you're describing, and in terms of an interim step to get to a more full design of the financial system. Can you speak to the role of a public bank as perhaps being serving as an NCO in its jurisdiction, or otherwise advancing Douglas social credit?
Mm-hmm. I think I could start off by saying that the NCO is a public bank. I mean, it's intended to serve as a public bank. But in terms of what do we do between here and there was a social credit government elected in the province of Alberta in 1935 during the Great Depression, and they made various attempts to try to implement various aspects of Douglas's ideas, but they were always thwarted or overturned by higher authorities, the courts, the federal government, the Privy Council, the imperial government, etc. But one of the things that they managed to do in Alberta was to create and it still exists to this day, a public banking system in the province, right? So I mean, it's quite the task to go from where we are to what Douglas envisaged, and so I'm all in favor of trying to improve the system as we can. It's not all going to happen at once. It's got to evolve, right? And certainly, I think public banks can play a role in that.
Okay, so that was a very short break, but we have a good 15 minutes. So Jeff and Dr. Heydorn, maybe even if Jeff, you have a comment for Oliver, and Oliver, if you have a comment for Jeff, and then we will move on to as many questions.
No, I mean, welcome a lot of us shared with us and subscribe to it all, apart from him saying that it wasn't basic income. I mean, you differentiate the proposal from basic income by saying basic income is tax or debt funded. And of course, there are some schemes that are like that. I mean, my friend Malcolm Torrey and Stuart Lansley have both created schemes, UBI schemes, which are tax funded. But there was a reason for that. The reason is to try to get in the thin edge of the wedge, if you like, to be able to say to the present political administrations, look, there is a version that is revenue neutral. So, but in my own writing, certainly it's equivalent to what Douglas says, that you'd have a basic income funded by debt-free sovereign money. But this curious thing to me, actually, is that Keynes, as you probably know, is rather derisory of Douglas, and then the closing pages of the general theory, he sort of puts him down without any rationale. It's just some kind of emotional rejection from Keynes to Douglas. So I've never figured out why that is. I think it's mainly because Keynes, of course, was trying to argue for wage. You know, he's arguing for wage as income, and that wage was an expression of demand and not just a cost of production. So he was seeking to turn neoclassical theory on its head, which is why he didn't welcome a sort of a non-wage proposal from Douglas. But that's my only guess.
Yes, Keynes actually had been present when C.H. Douglas provided evidence before the British Macmillan Committee. I think that was 1930. And we have the record of their discussion. You know, Keynes was asking certain questions and Douglas was responding. We tend to think that Keynes went down the road he went down because the idea of giving individuals money and therefore independence and freedom through the national dividend was one step too far as the powers that be were concerned. They couldn't countenance something so radical. And so Keynes, in effect, he finds another way of filling the gap through government spending. With regards to the basic income thing, I suppose one of the reasons, in addition, that we are not inclined to call the national dividend a universal basic income or to put it under that rubric is that it depends on the size of the gap. So it's not, the national dividend is not guaranteed. As I was saying in the presentation, if too many people decide, no, we're not going to work, we're just going to, we'll loaf, and production declines, then it will become more and more difficult to meet basic costs with the dividend. So the dividend is indexed to productivity. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, UBI seems to have this idea of a guaranteed amount. And we say, well, it can fluctuate. It goes up and down depending on how well the economy is performing and what it can actually afford.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's okay, John.
Yeah. So one question. Are both of you familiar with this book by Macmillan, The End of Banking?
I'm not.
Neither of you? I would encourage you to look at it. They have a newer, this is 2014, but just as I listen to each of you, they have maybe a third variance. It's not basic income, it's not universal basic income. It's not, it's not even, I guess you use the term, Oliver, universal. They use the term unconditional income. And it's in chapter 10, a crucial, really their reform policy, but the difference, it's a monetary policy. Unconditional income is only a means to an end, the end being price stability. But it's universal in the sense that it goes to everybody when the purchasing power of money needs this new injection of money to keep it stable, and not across months and years, but across generations is their goal. And they basically call for the public organization of money and the private organization of credit, as in the borrowing, lending, investing of already existing money. I will stop there and bring Elizabeth to ask a question, unless either of you want to comment. You can do that first. Whoops. I think we lost others. Anyhow, Elizabeth, go ahead with your question.
Okay. Well, basically, what I get from all those things is that our major problem is that all money is created with debt. And as the economy increases, we need more money. Now, what would be the mechanics of doing that? Like, I get every Christmas a nice Christmas card from our Prime Minister. Maybe there should be a $10 bill, a $100 bill in it, or whatever. So, as the economy increases, more money should be in circulation. But how are the mechanics of doing that? Would it just print cash and then distribute it to people? And one of my questions is, I know that Gaddafi distributed the profits from the oil to the people. How did he do it? Did he just hand out everybody money, or what is the mechanics of doing it? We can't, we can print paper money and give it to everybody. How can you do it? That's my question.
Well, as far as the Douglas social credit proposals are concerned, the added money is in fact the dividend and the discount. So there are at least two ways that could be done. You could have a system of state-mediated credit creation, where this debt-free injection is provided through the banking system, or you could use what in AMI circles is termed public money, or something like the greenback money, where you are providing additional money through the state's power of coinage, essentially. And yeah, the basic idea from a DSC point of view anyway, is that the economy actually needs debt-free input.
Yes.
Because of the gap, we can't, if we didn't have a gap, if there wasn't the price income gap, you could run an economy on a debt-based system, and it wouldn't cause as many problems as it's causing. But because we have a debt-based system, the only way to fill a gap is to borrow more money into existence to meet existing production debts. And that obviously is a system that doesn't solve the problem, but merely kicks the can down the road. And it gets worse and worse over time. So bottom line from Douglas is that the economy and individuals and the whole society needs a debt-free input if you're going to have a debt money system at all.
But how you do it? Do you just print paper money and give it to people? You can't just say to the banks, okay, here is government money, we put it in. How you physically do it? And that is my question.
Why not?
Well,
Why can't you just have everybody's bank account and stick $1,000 in it electronically?
But who puts it in? The government?
Yeah.
The government says, okay, here is $1,000.
Yeah. Why not?
That can be done.
Yeah.
The National Credit Office.
Thank you,
So
Elizabeth.
if you don't have a bank account, what
Ah,
happens?
well, it would be a big incentive to get one, wouldn't it?
Thank you,
Okay.
Elizabeth. We will jump ahead to Ellen and then John and Joe.
Thanks. I appreciated both of your presentations. Thank you very much. My questions are for Oliver. Great to meet you by Zoom. I've studied your work quite a bit. I just want to say one thing to Elizabeth. Our government has done that, and what they did was send out basically debit cards that were worth a certain amount. So whether or not you had a banking account, you could use this debit card and cash it out. So my questions are, what I've never understood was B. If B is capital expenditures, it seems to me that they still are going to somebody. They're going to producers. They're going to pay the rent on the equipment or whatever. And so that's somebody in the economy who could then spend the money. So that's my first question. My second question is, you mentioned that private banks would still be creating the credit as they are now, but that it would be limited to productive purposes, not speculative purposes. Well, we'd like to do that too in our public banking models, but I don't know how you would actually implement that. I mean, how does a bank know what somebody is borrowing the money for? And even if the if they go to great lengths to find out, how do they know what it's going to be invested in or whether that's going to be a productive investment? Anyway, those are my two questions.
Okay. So regarding the first question, the B payments, we say that the B payments are revenue, business revenue, not consumer income. And so some of that revenue is going to be destroyed. It went into prices, but it was never converted into consumer income. Some of it could get locked into the system. So if businesses develop reserves of various kinds, the money that's going through that channel is helping to build up costs and prices, but it's not being transformed into consumer income of proper persons, wages, salaries, dividends in the same period, or perhaps not at all. This is it's a very subtle and difficult thing to understand, perhaps. But one of the examples that Douglas gives is, let's say you run a complete credit cycle. Someone borrows money, they $100,000, they pay workers to set up a factory. They then issue shares. They collect the 100,000 from the workers. The money and the debt cancel each other out. You now have an industrial asset in existence, and businesses will levy charges on that for to replace it, to maintain it, etc., etc. But the money that was involved in its creation is gone. That's past history. So his basic idea is you've got all these industrial assets that are building up that businesses are charging for, but there's no automatic consumer income on the other side of the equation to balance the costs. And so that's why you have to go in and use a credit card, because your wages are not sufficient to cover all the costs that businesses have to cover in order to remain in operation. The other question, how can we, I suppose, eliminate or cut down at least on the speculative element? That is something which there are different ways that it could be done, and different social creditors have different ideas. But you could have, for example, 100% reserve system that's exogenous. In other words, private banks would be able to create credit, but then the NCO would have to back all their credit with equivalent in reserves. So if they create 100,000 to lend to a business, the NCO would have to backstop that with 100,000 in reserves. The minute that it becomes clear that a bank doesn't have a very good record, is making very risky or silly decisions, and of course we're assuming that in itself would be restricted because of legislation that we put in place. But the NCO could say, no, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. No more. I'm not going to let you create any more credit because you've violated the terms of our agreement. And without the reserves, they wouldn't be able to continue. So Douglas said that private banks should be licensed, and to ensure that they're serving the common interest, common policy. And if it turns out that some bank is creating a problem, well, they can be sanctioned or they can be delicensed, I suppose. That's a very broad answer to your question, but
okay.
Yeah.
Well, of course, banks would fail if they were making risky loans, et cetera, that didn't pay off. But I wouldn't call a productive loan just necessarily one that pays back. I'm talking about things like investing in hedge funds that are speculating. I mean, strictly betting on things that do not produce anything. They're just driving up the price of assets. Is there a way to limit that? I wish I knew of such a way.
Mm-hmm. I suppose you could do it through legislation.
Yeah. Well,
that's
I guess
something.
you haven't thought through it either.
Well,
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you, Ellen.
we will move on to John. Thanks, Ellen. Ugh, sorry, somebody else spotlighting. Thanks, John.
Just very quickly to answer Ellen's question, it's only sociopaths who do the hedge fund stuff. So lock them up. The other thing that Douglas is proposing altogether, and I'm sort of just checking with you, is that the people have a say in the price structure. The question is are the costs being externalized? And if they're being externalized, then you raise the price and then you give people enough money to pay it.
Mhm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, yes. Under the existing system, goods and services that are cheaper have a double advantage. They have the natural advantage of, well, the fact that they're cheaper, but also there's the fact that people, maybe they would want other things, but they can't afford it, right? They'd have to go into debt in order to buy the things that they actually prefer. But if you ensure from the get-go that there's always enough consumer income to balance out costs and prices, then things that people can't afford now would become affordable. And we might find that people will want items that last a lot longer, that they won't go with the cheapest items with built-in obsolescence, because not simply because they're cheaper, but maybe the only thing they can afford. So it would change the whole dynamics of what they really want would be more easily reflected in their choices, because they would be sufficiently enfranchised with consumer buying power.
One other little thing. Douglas was really clear that he was being political. This is a possible solution. He wasn't saying this is the ideal, but this would solve the problem. And it should be politically doable. And that the fact that he couldn't even get it done where they elected a social credit government should just tell us all something. I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Jeff, do you have any comment before we move on?
No, let the questions go.
Okay.
Is
Steve, should we
is
take
there a
one more?
question? Yeah, is there a quick question for Jeff? Because Oliver's had two. Does someone have a quick question for Jeff? Joe, do
I
you?
do.
Okay,
I do.
Joe.
It applies to Oliver, but it's for Jeff. Jeff, one of the versions of UBI has been discussed is universal basic services, so that we do have a limit not on the money but on the resources, land, labor, and capital. And as the quote we were given about providing the best of possible goods applies to that we need to focus on the essential goods and services. We've got to make sure they're met first. They have to be the highest priority goods and services. And then if we have more, we have things left over, then we can use spend them on less essential goods and services. So the proposal is that the money be spent not on providing education, on health, on infrastructure, on a sustainable planet, all those things. It relates to the freedom budget. We talked about that with Les Leopold yesterday, Martin Luther King's approach. Also, one of those essentials is a living wage job, which would also help to reduce the need for UBI. And if some individuals, no matter what, need more, then you could have individual welfare. Would that be acceptable in your scheme of things?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion, as you know, in our circles. I mean, Anna Coote in the UK is a great proponent of UBS. She sees it rather than UBI. But again, I mean, in the UK, we already have more UBS than you have in the States, because we have a free at point of use health service. My view is, of course, this is slightly a political and philosophical question, but my view is that universal basic services can apply quite readily to health and education, because most of us want the same things in health and education. If I've broken my leg, I want it fixed. If I want my kid to learn French, there's a kind of similarity. But I think that in other scopes, like what house I want to live in, what transport means I want to use, that there's more dissimilarity in what each person might choose. And I do believe in a sort of a free society where the individual is enabled to choose through a basic income rather than rather patronized by the state as to what they're going to have. And if it were free at the point of consumption, how are you going to limit the demand for it? So you made chocolate free at the base. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit. Then, of course, you know, the demand become. I remember when I was a kid, you see, I lived in public sector housing. And we used to, every 2 years, those houses' front doors are painted by the local council. And as kids, we used to stand around saying, you know, what colour's our house door going to be? And they'd say, it's going to be crushed strawberry, you know, that's been decided by some bureaucrat in the city council. Most of us kids had never heard of crushed strawberry. And the point was, at the end of the day, I came away thinking, I'd like to decide what colour my front door is. So in that sense, I'm rather wary of the patronising nature implied by universal basic services beyond health and education. And I'm in favour of giving people choice with a basic income.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for your presentations and your responses. What is maybe most exciting is that so many of us are doing serious work systemically and in the real world, and motivated by the common values that I think have been expressed. So keep up the work and keep in dialogue with each other and with us, and maybe our grandchildren or their grandchildren will actually have a sustainable, just, peaceful, flourishing, not simply surviving life within this planet to live.
Agreed.
So thank you.